Have you ever rigged up, carried everything to the beach, and then the forecasted wind just wouldn't show up? Reading wind forecasts can be confusing, so today I want to share with you how to read them correctly so you can save yourself frustration with winds that just won't show up, or even possibly worse, missing a day that is actually windy despite the forecast not giving anything. So there are a couple of different things to understand about the weather and the wind to assess a forecast correctly. First, it's actually super important to understand how forecasting itself actually works. But this will only get you so far. To really get a grasp on why the wind is sometimes much stronger or weaker than forecasted, it's also super important to understand about local weather effects. For example, land and sea breezes, gap winds, katabatic winds, all that stuff. And by the way, this knowledge will not only help you to understand wind forecasts better, but also can give you an understanding of when you're actually out on the water, where on the water the wind will be stronger and weaker. And this knowledge is super important if you're actually racing, for example, in long distance races or course races. This knowledge is key to actually perform good on the water. So there's a couple of really popular applications for wind forecasting for windsurfers, also kitesurfers and wingers, of course. And just to name a few, there's Windfinder, there's WindGuru, there's Windy, and then there's a lot more, but those are, I think, the three most popular ones. And I often hear the discussion, which forecast is best? Is it Windfinder? Is it WindGuru? Is it Windy? And people seem to have really an opinion on which of these apps is actually the best. But that's a bit beside the point, because I think many people actually don't really know what the difference between the different applications is. So let's get into that. For this, we have to take a look at how weather predictions actually work. So I don't know how many of you know this, but I was actually in shipping for a few years after I finished school. And this knowledge about the weather is actually crucial to make the important decisions on board to navigate a ship safely. So now that I'm no longer in shipping, but in windsurfing, of course, I can use this knowledge that I gained there to find the best conditions out there for windsurfing. But how do weather predictions actually work? First of all, a weather prediction is only as good as the data you put into it. For this, meteorologists gather information from weather stations all over the world, balloons that rise up 30 kilometers into the air, radar for rainfall and storm tracking, as well as satellites, airplanes and ships. Fun fact, when I was in shipping on a commercial vessel, we actually did this report to the weather stations every once in a while from sea, because you don't have stations all over the ocean. So the data you gather from ships that send you the weather data is actually really crucial to making good weather forecasts. All of this data then goes into a supercomputer that, by implementing fluid dynamic equations as well as thermodynamics, creates a model or simulation predicting the weather. And this process is actually one of the most computing intensive processes there are. So to make it manageable, the simulation is dividing the area into a grid, meaning that there are points all over the area for which different values like air pressure, humidity and so on are calculated. And because of these restrictions of needing a lot of processing power, you can either generate a model that has a wider grid, so less points per area, but therefore can give a very long prediction of a couple of days, or you can create a model that has way more points per area, so a narrower grid, but therefore it doesn't go as far into the future. And the models with a wider grid often even span worldwide, while the models with a closer knit grid actually are most of the times very localized, so have a smaller area that they cover. But what model should you trust at your local spot? Generally, the wider grid models can give you a good big picture trend and longer forecast with a higher reliability. So let's say you're planning a session on the weekend and it's now Tuesday or Wednesday, or you're planning your holiday that's in 1 week. You're better off to look at one of those models with a wider grid. The advantage of a more localized model with a closer grid, so more points per area, is that it can incorporate certain effects like terrain effects and local wind phenomena much better. But let's get back to our original question. Which application should you look at or trust? Now that we know about different weather models and how they are calculated, we can answer this question. So the only difference between all of the different weather applications is which models they can incorporate into their forecast or have access to. Let's take a look at, for example, Windfinder. If we open Windfinder, we get access to two forecasts that are called the normal forecast, and then they have a super forecast. The normal forecast is derived from the GFS weather model. This is a model that is spanning worldwide and has a grid of 25 kilometers. So each point that is calculated is relatively far apart. In contrast to that, the super forecast actually uses a model with a way better resolution, so around 7 kilometers, But therefore, of course, the forecast is more localized. So knowing this, we should take a look at the normal forecast if we're looking for the general trend. Will there be wind, like let's say next week? Maybe it's not really correct by the day, but we know, okay, something is coming. So for this, the GFS or normal forecast on Windfinder gives us a super good trend. But then let's say we're on the actual day of the forecast where the wind is supposed to be. Then we're better off to look at the super forecast to actually incorporate all of these local terrain and local wind phenomena effects. And with that, we can determine how strong is the wind actually going to be, because there the super forecast will be more accurate with a closer grid model. And also maybe to determine which spot exactly are we going to, if there's a few spots that are a few kilometers apart. And then we can really tell by using the super forecast which of these spots will be the windiest. And this is especially important if you're windsurfing on a spot that has very strong local weather effects. Then another application that is super popular around water sports enthusiasts is WindGuru. And I personally also like WindGuru a lot. So what WindGuru does, it has access to a lot more models, I think like 6, 7, depends I think on the region where you're looking at. So a lot more already than Windfinder. And then what WindGuru does, if you look at the top forecast, this one is just called WindGuru. And what that is, it is just an interpolation of all the different models that they use for the forecasts, and then kind of just gives us an average of what all the different models say. And just for simplicity, I really like to look at that one, because with one look, I have basically the data of all of the different models averaged out. And this is oftentimes I find quite accurate. But more in general, if you're looking at the different applications, what you really want to look for is what are the forecasts based on? Because the applications are not making their predictions themselves. They're just basically using different weather models. So understanding what weather models they use for their predictions is super important to understand what we're looking at. Yeah, local wind effects are a really big topic, because basically every hill and every different piece of terrain can really affect the wind a lot. So in this video, we'll just go over the most important ones for us as windsurfers, and yeah, basically those that affect us the most on the water. First up, let's talk about sea breezes, as those are basically present on any body of water. A sea breeze is a wind that is coming from the ocean towards the coast. Land and water can save heat at different rates. So on a sunny day, the sun is heating up the air over the water much slower than the air over the land. The warm air over the land will then start to rise and create low pressure over the land. This low pressure is then filled by the more dense cool air over the ocean. So the air over the ocean moves towards the shore. And this is what sea breezes are. And these winds, of course, can vary in strength greatly depending on where you are exactly, how hot the day is getting, how much force the sun has. So in general, if you're like, for example, like me in Northern Europe during summer, this effect will be stronger as the sun just has more power to heat up the air. And in winter, it will be less strong. And of course, there's a similar effect during the night, because then it's the other way around. The ocean will lose the heat much slower than the air over the land will lose the heat. So then we get a wind from the land towards the sea. But this doesn't really affect us as windsurfers so much, because generally, I don't know about you, but I like to go during the day. Next up, we have gap winds, and gap winds are super cool. Gap winds are just basically the winds that are accelerated by the passage between two mountains. As the air has to kind of squeeze through a narrow passage, of course, the wind will accelerate during this passage. And a good example for this happening is the Strait of Gibraltar. Here we have the closest point between the African continent and the European continent. And on both sides we have tall mountains on the African coast as well as on the Spanish coast. Then what happens is that wind from either side, from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, or the other way around, from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, has to squeeze through this gap in between the continents, and by that gets accelerated a lot. And this is exactly the reason why spots like Tarifa that are located right there have such a high wind reliability, because any little base wind that would usually, let's say, just 8 knots will be accelerated through this passage, and you will have a very nice wind in the end. Let's go over valley winds. These winds often occur in mountainous regions. During the day, the sun heats up the slopes over the valleys much quicker than the air over the valleys themselves. And this causes the air to rise up the valleys during the day when the sun is shining. Similarly, during nighttime, the wind will flow down the valleys as the air over the slopes gets much colder, and this cold dense air will then flow down the valley. Of course, there's a lot more local wind effects than the ones I just mentioned. For example, there's cape effects where the wind will kind of accelerate around a cape and many more. But for the purpose of this video, not to let it blow up to like 20 minutes or something, I think these were the most important wind phenomena that we need to understand to kind of interpret the forecast better. So let's take a forecast and try to understand a forecast from Lake Garda. If we look at the regular GFS model, for example, by looking at Windfinder, the normal forecast, generally you will not see a lot of wind there for the area around Lake Garda. It will give maybe 6 or 8 knots, something like this, so you would think, there's not enough wind to go windsurfing there. But that's a lot of times not the case. So how can we read the wind forecast then? We now know that the regular forecast on Windfinder is using the GFS model that has a very wide grid. Lake Garda, on the other hand, has very localized wind effects. On the one hand, we have the winds that are going up the valley during the daytime and then flowing down during nighttime. On the other hand, of course, we have very tall mountains on either side of the lake. So every little bit of wind is accelerated through this gap. And the problem with the wide grid forecasts, like for example GFS, is that they don't take any of these local wind effects into consideration. So the normal forecast will only give you kind of the base wind in the region, but will not take into effect any localized weather effects. So here we're much better off at looking at a model with a closer grid. For example, the Windfinder Super Forecast. This one has a 7-kilometer grid instead of a 25-kilometer grid, so can already predict localized wind effects much better. And generally, if we take a look at the forecast for Lake Garda, if we look at this model, the Super Forecast, it will give us more wind than the GFS model. But still, a lot of times the wind is actually much stronger than even the Super Forecast suggests. Why is that the case? This is because no model is perfect. We still have a 7-kilometer grid. If we had infinite points and perfect data, we could predict the weather perfectly, but we don't. We only have limited processing power, and we also have only limited input values for the weather around the world. So for this region, just understanding the local wind effects at play is super crucial. So what you can do is you can check a bunch of different things now that we know how the wind is created here. One, is there a base south or north wind? Let's say we have a base wind of 5 knots from the south. Then the next thing we can look at is it a sunny, warm day? Because we know that this will accelerate the valley effect of the wind from the south pushing up to the Alps. So if this is also the case, we can be pretty sure that we will have a solid wind day, even though the forecast might only give us 5 or 6 knots. And that's basically how we can use our knowledge of local wind effects and understanding weather forecasting to determine the actual wind on any given day. Alright, I hope you found this video useful and maybe it helps you a bit in understanding your local forecast. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and also I'm thinking to do a similar video about storm fronts and how we read those. So if you're interested in that video, let me know down below in the comments and I'll get straight to it. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one, guys. Bye bye.